Institute are very proud to serve as the venue for the artistic salon of the Human Impacts Chicago and the Transatlantic Climate Bridge of the German Embassy. As leaders in renewable energy, Germany has incredible knowledge to share regarding successful energy policies and communication efforts. And Human Impact and their esteemed panelists, whom Tara will introduce to you later, will explore how creative solutions to climate change are reinventing the urban landscape and how designers are transforming the way we produce, consume, and interact with the world around us. This salon is the 5th in a creative communication series. Salons were also held in New York, in Atlanta, in Washington, D.C., in Miami, and in Boston. And now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Tara Before, who will lead you through the program. Thank you.
I think it's always good when you start off putting your wine under the chair, right? And it's nice and hot in here, so don't you feel climate change kind of in the room? So I'm just going to really quickly give you a little introduction into a little bit of what you're getting into tonight. And you're already seated, and we're going to close the doors so you can't leave. But I'm the founder and executive director of the Human Impacts Institute, and we're really excited to come to Chicago. Our idea for this whole series of salons is how can we re-communicate climate issues to really inspire a US audience to want to take action. And so in each city we've been to and that we're going to, we're picking something that kind of speaks a little bit to the heartbeat of the city. And when we thought of design, as New Yorkers, we're always very envious of all of the amazing design thinking that's going on in Chicago. So we thought that would be a great place to start for conversation. So if you came today to really get really deep into what each of the panelists are doing and to have 15 to 20 minute presentations each, you're going to be really disappointed. As all of the speakers know, they don't know what we're going to talk about today. So it's very fresh conversation. You're going to get a lot of hopefully big ideas. You're also going to learn a little bit about what they're doing, and we'll have networking at the end so that you can delve more and ask more. And my hope, and all of our hope at the Human Impacts Institute, is that you really come out of this inspired to really do something in your own personal way. So to get started, this is Human Impacts Chicago, Designing for a New Climate, and we're going to have an amazing kickoff with some inspiration from very own J.W. Basillo from Chicago Slamworks. Come on up, J.W.
All right, okay. I like mics. I don't like holding. I'm going to set it down. Is that okay?
You want me to stand next to you?
No. Would you? No. Cool. So thank you, Tara, for having me. My name is J.W. Basillo. I'm a performance poet, writer, and director here in the city. I'm also the executive director of a group called Chicago Slamworks. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to the advancement of performance poetry in Chicago and throughout the world. A lot of people don't know that poetry slam, performance poetry in the modern age is actually born in Chicago. And that show, the Uptown Poetry Slam, that kind of started all of them, has gone on for, we're in almost in our 29th year now. And Mark Smith and I host that show every single week together. I had no idea why we were invited to be here, but it was. But the more I started looking into what Human Impact does, it started to make a lot more sense. I got just an email that said climate change. I was like, I don't know anything about that, except that it's supposed to get warmer. Penguins. So the more I looked into it, the more it seems like we link up quite a bit. We also have a small connection in that on behalf, or with the assistance of the German consulate and the Goethe Institute, I've had the fortune of doing a whole bunch of shows in Germany. I was just there a couple years ago for 2 years in a row, actually, with their Meisterschaft, their master poetry slam, the big one. So it all is starting to make sense. So in terms of what we do as an organization, a lot of our teaching artists and a lot of our performing artists are activists, and we work very, very much in social justice and human impact as it relates to the city that we live in. So while we don't have a whole lot to say necessarily about climate change specifically, we do have a lot to say about the climate and the culture of this city and the culture of the country, but specifically this city and the students that we work with. We are teaching artists, performing artists, we do theater and all kinds of things. So I'm going to share with you just a little something, just to get things started on a really sad note. No, not funny. That's cool. That's fine. Just to get things started on a sad note, I will just say opportunity, because that's a euphemism. I had the opportunity to teach performance poetry at Cook County Juvenile Detention for a year. It was the first time they had ever done something like that, and they essentially opened the doors and said, there's a room, there are a bunch of student inmates, go teach them things. So, and I learned quite a bit about the trouble that our city faces from the inside and how that moves. So this is a piece called Forget. Human beings need contact, but the boys here aren't allowed to make it. Sometimes we sneak in some daps, sometimes a fight breaks out, but no one in here gets touched without a fist. Forget that this is a prison. Pretend if you must that these teenage boys are here on their own accord, that they've stumbled in from some pickup game somewhere and just decided to let me teach. Forget criminal. Forget that Eric hasn't been touched since a rival crew split his lip last week, and that in 10 days he will catch a bullet in his back and I will start to cry when I hear the news because I've forgotten that this is a prison right now. All you need to know is that the boys have abandoned their spades for the moment. Tucked the decks inside their state-issued pockets for the first time since the day I started. They are beating their tattooed hands in unison on desktops as I hold a microphone. And I press stop, and then loop. And the boys nod their heads, fumble through their notebooks, tightening up their 16 bars as the ghosts of their fists and formica rattle muffled from the speakers of my laptop. For the next few minutes, I will forget how much I hate this gig and how much the boys pretend to hate me, and we will all forget how I'm supposed to be teaching poetry right now. Because Corey shakes his saplings of dreadlock in my direction, calling for the mic, and this kid is a stunner. His cadence never wavers, even when he's trying to clown me. He rides his bars back to a hook I can barely decipher, but will never forget. And it's Eric's turn now. And the boys are still nodding their heads, propping up the kid, even though Eric couldn't catch a beat with both hands. But the mic, it rotates around me, palm to palm, until everyone has had his chance to spit. By the end, most everyone has trickled back to the other side of room, met with dap from the guards and the familiar smack of a well-played spade, calling the book in that garbled cursing while not actually cursing pidgin they speak in, because we let it pass, because at least they're doing something today. But not Corey. He's rushing back to his table to get his fresh bars to paper before the words have left his head. He folds the loose leaf up, wraps it around his ankle before pulling up his sock. And he sneaks a pencil in there too. And I see it. But I'm not giving him a hard time. Not today. Because Eric has pulled up his chair at my desk, watching enraptured as I cut the track together, dragging the peaks and troughs of their voices around the screen. I'm a few clicks away from completion when Eric shifts in his chair, and his knee leans into mine. And for some reason, we don't move away. Forget that this is a prison. Forget all you know. The gay panic snicker, the joke about soap that isn't funny. Right now, Eric forgets that I am perhaps the only white man he's ever known without a hand around his throat, without cuffs or a gavel, and I forget that I spend more energy hating this job than I actually do teaching. Forget that one wrong glance from across the room might catch this prayer in action, that Eric is a boy with more manhood than I might ever know, and manhood is always just one good touch away from breaking, and we are just two human beings again. I never saw Eric after that day. He was released back to his neighborhood, out less than a week when they got him. When the bullet splashed into his back, before it all went dim, his prayers spilling out there on the sidewalk, I hope someone was there. I hope someone held his hand.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think you're going to see as the night goes on how topics such as criminal justice and youth and the many things that JW brought up connect back to climate change and how we address these issues. So I'm going to call up, I hope you guys are feeling inspired, maybe a little sad start, but we're gonna jump into this, and we thought this was a great quote to start with. The best way to predict the future is to design it. So when we're talking about design today, we're thinking of a really big picture of design, of thinking, of creation. So each of us, in a way, are designing. And so maybe we're not designing buildings, but we're designing our lives, we're designing our interactions with one another, we're designing, many choices that we make throughout. So keep that as a context throughout. And we have a little video to start us off. Oh, no we don't. In a moment, actually. I'm going to invite up the panelists first, and then we have a short video. We have Dr. Georg Mauer. Come on up. It's like Price is Right now. And welcome. He is the first Secretary of Climate and Energy Policy at the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany, all the way from DC. And we have Janet Atarian. Come on up. Who is an AIA and lead AP project director for the Chicago Department of Transportation Streetscape and Sustainable Design Program. And then we have Matthew Atwood. Woo! Come on up. This is Matthew here. We don't have Matthew yet, so he'll appreciate that later. And we have Elizabeth Moyer, Associate Professor of Atmospheric Chemistry and Transport at the University of Chicago. Come on up. And we'll just, we're going to get rid of one chair. Perfect. I have to remember my wine. All right, so we have a little video to get you started and get our panelists thinking for the first step. All right, go ahead.
Thanks, Jim Cantori. Now, as Miami deals with flooding, Chicago is feeling the heat. Ironically, this is the first full day of fall, and this is day 5 of triple-digit temperatures. This late-season heat wave puts us on pace for the hottest September on record. If it verifies, it will be the 3rd warmest September in the past 12 years. So let's take a look at the forecast temperatures for today. At Navy Pier, 96 degrees, just a short walk to Michigan Avenue, and the temperature jumps to 99. Willis Tower will top out at 101, and Wrigley Field, 99 degrees. The heat is a huge factor in tonight's Cubs game against Canada's Alberta Clippers. Edmonton, like many northern cities, is one of the fastest growing right now, due in part to the pleasantly mild fall temperatures in the upper 60s. The Cubbies are playing at night to avoid the hottest part of the day, but even so, temperatures at game time will be in the 90s.
So are you guys thoroughly confused? To me, I'm like, I've never been to Chicago. That sounds great. I don't know what's going on. It's not 93 out, but so that's a little video that playing on 2050. What could 2050 look like in a playful way? And we wanted to use this as an introduction of, if we look at climate change, what exactly are we designing for? What are we seeing in the future? What's happening? What are we looking towards? We could have the next one. So I want to open it up actually for any of you. If you're looking at what are we designing for? Are we designing for sustainability? Are we designing for equity in human systems? What are we designing for? Maybe Georg, do you want to take a stab at that first?
Yeah. Well, thanks. Well, actually, I would think humans don't have to design the world because the world is doing their own thing, but we interact it. So the climate change clearly is something humans changed, and that is why we have to interact to change that climate change. And the way we should do it, in my view, is we have the chance to live in a more sustainable way. We have the chance to use energy, which is the biggest cause, the biggest impact on climate change from humans. We have to use energy in a different way. and we can adapt to climate change. So these are the two things we can do. We can mitigate the emissions and we can adapt. So, and that is how the design, I would say, looks like, and I would vision the way forward to 2050.
And Janet, what do you think? What are we designing for?
Well, I think we're actually, when we look at the future, we're actually designing for today, because we know that a couple of things are happening with the populations across the world, but specifically here in the United States. I think it's 1.5 million people are hitting 65 every day now in the United States, and we're going to peak at about 2020, and that's going to hold steady through about 2033. We've got the whole millennial generation that wants to be in cities, they're driving less, they're not getting their driver's license. So we have to be designing for people that want to have other modes of transportation besides driving, which is actually great for climate change if we can give them the options. And these people, because of that, they want to be in cities because they need that proximity. They need that ability to walk to their grocery store, to walk to their entertainment. They either are aging out of driving or they're never interested. And so when I look at the future, I think we've got to do that right now. It's happening now. And of course, you can say that with all the climate change too, right? I mean, you can't, when you look at things like infrastructure and designing cities, they don't get designed in a day. So when you're looking at 2050, you need to be designing for 2050 right now, because anything you're building now should sure be around in 2050.
Yeah, we'd hope so, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's always true, but we'd hope so. And I want to come to you, Liz, because we had an interesting conversation around climate change and this idea of uncertainty, and that to some degree we don't fully know what the future brings. Can you tell us a little bit about this idea of uncertainty and what we're dealing with?
Sure, but I want to say also, if we're talking about design, I mean, from a climate change perspective, the answer is we're not designing, right? And we're not designing policy, we're not designing infrastructure. There's very little actual effort in the United States. There's no such thing as an energy policy. We don't have an Office of Energy Policy. You know, countries like Germany are taking a more active role in thinking about how they would shape their energy infrastructure 20, 30, 40 years ahead. The United States is not doing that right now. We've never done it. It's not a new thing. It's just we don't have a department in the government that does that. We don't think that that's the purpose of government. So that takes a change for us. If we want to do that kind of design, that's not something that we've done in the past. It's not something that we have even an infrastructure set up to do, a bureaucratic infrastructure. So in terms of uncertainty, I said when I said I would talk here that I'd be happy to tell people a little bit about what we think we can robustly predict versus what we can't predict. So it is not possible at this moment to tell you exactly how warm it will be in any particular place, not just because we don't totally know the spatial distribution of warming, but because we don't know right now, to within maybe a factor of 2 or so, what the climate sensitivity will be. So even if you know what the emissions are going to be in the future, you don't exactly know the temperature. But in general, you know, we've looked at 100 years of climate science, we have not been able to come up with any sort of numerical model that makes the world cooler when you add more CO2. There's lots of uncertainty, but the fact is it pretty robustly gets hotter when you add more CO2. And from the scientific point of view, in the absence of any other change, it would definitely get hotter when you add CO2. The question is does something else magically happen to compensate? And the big uncertainty is in clouds, which is my field of research because it's the big uncertainty. So clouds can amplify the warming or they can reduce the warming, depending on what kind of change you make in clouds and what altitude. And that is just a really hard problem to study. So we are, for the foreseeable future, any decision we make is going to be in those conditions of uncertainty. So robustly, it'll get hotter, but we don't know exactly how much. The northern and southern, the more high latitude areas get warmer than the low latitude areas. So Alaska is looking at a lot more warming than we are in Chicago, and we're looking at more warming than Miami. Rainfall, pretty robustly the case that on average over the whole world, the rainfall goes up by about 3% per degree of warming. And every single model does that, and that's a very standard underlying basic physics reason for that. And the rain will tend to come more intensely, and therefore if it goes up and is more intense, it also is going to become, well, so the way it scales is it becomes less frequent. So we're looking at fewer rainfall events, but each one is more intense, which people who do urban planning think, oh wait, that means more flooding. So that's a pretty robust prediction everywhere. In general, the areas that are already dry. The desert areas tend to dry out a little more, and so most of the burden of the extra water comes in the areas that are already wet. Basically, those that don't need more water don't get it, and those that don't need more water do get it. But beyond, within that, for a city planner, they say, I need to know exactly how much. You know, I need to know how high that seawall is. I need to know how much sea level will rise. I need to know exactly what temperature range I'm planning for, and we can't give those answers. So it's a design problem where the engineers don't have specific criteria.
Yeah, and I want to ask you guys, how do you deal with like super big, like huge uncertainty in your life? How are you? Like, if you didn't know where you were going to sleep tonight, how would you feel? Did someone say awesome? So they have a different interpretation of that question. So yeah, it's scary. It's scary. And I heard a lot of other words out there, but let's go with fear. How do you guys deal? Do you think you make good decisions when you're afraid? No? I see a few no's. Does anyone are like, yeah, I'm really on when I'm afraid? No? So this idea of uncertainty is a really big one when we're dealing with climate change, and what on earth are we dealing with? So I wanna move on because we have another question. So if we're thinking of, so we have design and we're designing our systems, we're designing our lives, and we have this changing climate that we have a lot of uncertainty about. What exactly do we need in order to make some decisions here? And Georg, I want to start with you again, and we'll bring up this. One idea is something that we need, an example of a success story or something that's working. Can you tell us a little bit about, hopefully you're familiar with this, about what's going on in terms of a success story that might help us feel a little safer with some decisions?
Yeah, I happen to be a little familiar with that. So I still would say that renewable energy is a success story for Germany. It shows that a country who decided, I mean, we are a very high industrialized country, and a lot of uncertainties over there, and industries very concerned about that, about a secure energy supply. And so we have to solve energy security, renewable energy, so emission-free or low emission energy in the same time. And we have to be able to pay for that. So these were the ideas when we decided in Germany to move towards renewable energy, more or less completely. And it works quite well. So at the moment, I mean, these figures are from 2012. I can tell you that the first half of this year shows that we are at 30% in the electricity sector already, which is...
That's 30% renewables.
30% renewables, right, in the first half of 2014. So on the average, it will be somewhere around 27 or so, or 28. So it's growing. We paid for that, but even the costs are going down. But what you read over here in this country, but also in Germany, is that we have this so-called feed-in tariff. So the idea to make that grow was to give money to the people, security to the people who invest, and then people invested. That's what happened. And of course, we paid a high price for the huge capacities we built between 29 and 2012. You can see that for solar PV maybe. But nevertheless, this it pays off. So today, the new capacities are very cheap compared to 5 years ago. So it is really a success story, and it will continue to grow.
Great, so that's one example. Maybe that can help us find a little bit of certainty, where we see something's working, something's happening there. And I want to go to you next, Janet. This is a little bit of an example of a project that you've been working on. So maybe if we're thinking of what do we need in order to address this changing climate, is it to know a little bit more about our communities and how they work?
Yes, I mean, I think it's not necessarily to know more about our communities. I think we all actually do know a lot about our communities. I think it's tapping into what people already know about their communities and then building on those strengths. You know, there's a lot of sort of natural sustainability, especially in some of our ethnic communities here in Chicago. This project was done in Pilsen, and the Field Museum actually had done a study where they had gone into several communities. This is one, really trying to understand what practices were already happening in those communities, how did they understand sustainability, even if they didn't use maybe that word or talk about it the way we sort of tend to talk about it here. And you know, projects like this, I think, build off of that and try to take some of it to the next level and take advantage of the fact that we cannot afford to invest a single dollar into anything, and certainly infrastructure, which is something I deal with a lot, unless we are constantly looking at that triple bottom line. I mean, there is no reason you should ever resurface a road or build a new sidewalk or put in a new light or, you know, create a wonderful new place if you're, and not also include environmental best practices, include placemaking, include active transportation in your decision making. There is no excuse for that. And it gets...
You can clap. You can clap.
And it makes sense, because then you get so much more for that dollar. And that's what we tried to do with this project, is we said, okay, we're going to go in, we need to reconstruct, the infrastructure here is a mess, but we are going to try to look at it very differently. We're going to make great places. We worked with the school, and we created a plaza that the kids could use, but we also infiltrated 100% of the stormwater. We took it from the building. We created a zero-depth stormwater feature so that it was something that was pleasant to look at and to be around. We actually used over 40% recycled materials. We reduced our energy use by over 50%. We used no potable water. We added bike lanes. We improved pedestrian movements. We put in pedestrian refuge. It's those synergies, and this is actually a really good example of that synergy you want to find, which is so fundamental to me about what sustainability is. And I think it's something people can grasp better than maybe the word sustainability, because, you know, this actually was a 20-foot wide sidewalk. We don't usually like to bump in sidewalks, but the cars were parking on the sidewalk, so it wasn't very fun for people to walk. And they were doing that because it's a heavy truck route. So we bumped in the sidewalk mid-block only, because you don't want to lengthen those pedestrian crossing distances at the corner. That enabled us to create a space where we could add the bike lane. We could make it permeable pavers. They were also high albedo, so they were helping with the urban heat island. They were also photocatalytic, so they actually self-clean and remove smog from the atmosphere. It helps with the lighting because of the reflectivity. It's infiltrating the stormwater, and they're pavers, so they're attractive. So pulling all these things together.
I'm getting really jealous right now. She's from the city. This is awesome. So this was actually the next question when we're thinking of what do we need. This was actually for Matt, who wasn't able to be here. But Liz, I think you might be able to speak to this a little bit. If we're thinking of what do we need to design for a changing climate, what about some creativity and thinking in new ways? You explore really big systems topics. Can you add a little bit to this idea?
Well, I think one of the issues that we have is that we aren't actually going to prevent climate change. You know, it's not, it will change, it is happening. There's no way we're not moving fast enough. You know, 30% of the electricity sector is great, but the electricity sector is only a third of the total energy use, and that's Germany, and we're the US. And you know, even though we try and it is increasing and we've got incentives for wind, I mean, stuff is happening. So in terms of creativity, I think we have to be somewhat creative in thinking about how we're going to deal with these big impacts, because the problem is the human psychology when you're faced with uncertainty is to say, wow, I don't know, I'm not going to do anything. That's honestly how most of us act, you know. And I got very nervous about climate change at one point, and I got to know some history professors at the University of Chicago. And I thought, wow, historians, you know all this stuff about people that I don't know. That's great, you know, I don't know anything about people. So let's ask you to say, when in history has any community ever seen an impact that's coming that hasn't happened yet, right? Like the Mongols are coming to cut your heads off, but they haven't cut anyone's head off yet. Do you build the Great Wall? Like, when has any civilization invested big to prevent something that hasn't caused you any pain yet? And then they went away and thought about it, and they thought about it, and then a couple days go by, and then I got an email. I was like, you know, we can't think of any example of when we've done that.
You guys are going to be the first, right?
So I think there has to be a little bit of creativity about thinking about the future, because it's not something we're good at doing. You know, and I don't say that you have to trust exactly the results that come out of a numerical model, but to be able to work your head into that state where you say, I'm pretty sure that something is going to be different, and I have to start getting used to doing long-range planning in a way that I'm not used to, and that people aren't really good at doing. That is a special skill, and it's a mental shift that's really hard for people to do. And I think people are going to have to work at it, but the more they do, the better.
Can I say something real quick?
Yeah.
I think you're right about the history example, but yet we have been able to set a goal and go for it, right? I mean, think about the space race and things like that. So it's a little different than sort of seeing the tragedy, because it frightens us. But when we set a goal, we are, if we have the right leadership and the right thing, we are able. And somehow I think that's what we have to sort of flip, is it being something that's just big and beyond us and that we don't understand, that just scares us, to somehow something where we have goals that we can get behind and sort of achieve as a notion and feel as a nation and feel pride for. I don't know how to do that, but
Yeah, and that's actually a great segue to the next topic we're going to bring up, of looking at a few examples of some big thinking and that is going on right now. And we have a little bit of, hopefully, an optimistic video to show you before we get to that question.
Meet the next generation, our children and grandchildren. Take a good look, because theirs can be a different world. They can be the first generation surrounded by products that are safe, healthy, and endlessly reusable. They can live and work in places designed to improve their lives. They can live without fear of chemical hazards in a world of abundance. They can reuse everything and throw away nothing. They are the cradle-to-cradle generation. The question is, how soon will you join this revolution with the products you buy? The answer to this question has to be now. And the Cradle-to-Cradle Products Innovation Institute is here to help. It's a nonprofit organization created to bring about a large-scale transformation in the way things are made. To provide third-party certification that products aren't just less bad, but are actually more good. To be the new standard of quality around the world. Cradle-to-Cradle certification guides the continuous improvement of products design and manufacturing. It has 5 levels of certification, beginning with basic, which gets a manufacturer started. Moving through each level of achievement, bronze, silver, gold, brings each product closer to the ideal platinum. Each step up creates products that are safer and healthier. The Institute certifies products that meet the criteria in 5 categories: material health, material reutilization, renewable energy use, water stewardship, and social fairness. These attributes, working together, drive innovation and are redefining product quality. This rethinking of how we design, manufacture, use, and reuse materials is already underway. It's creating more and more cradle-to-cradle certified products. It's differentiating, growing, and increasing the profits of the companies that make them. You'll find more consumers demanding them. You'll see certification written into more specifications, and more people recognizing that cradle-to-cradle certified says something special about a product and the way it's made. That it meets the new standard of quality and means that this generation can enjoy a world where rugs will clean our air, textile mills will detoxify our rivers, and where our waste will become food to bring about new life. Isn't that the world we want today for ourselves, our homes, our businesses, and most importantly, our children? Then let's make the world a better place now, because the cradle-to-cradle generation is waiting.
How many of you are like, ugh? There's one honest person in the room. I like this. Now I know who I'm dealing with. So if we look at that, we're looking at these big systems, and we're putting out all this gross stuff that's unhealthy for us, and we're creating products and buildings that are killing us, and that are hurting our communities. So how do we close this loop? How do we look at ways to kind of make that video that might seem just kind of crazy to some people, or cheesy, real? And I want to actually come to you again, Liz. We have a few examples up here because we were talking about some maybe geoengineering, and we brought up a few examples of things that are being done right now, particularly the three, in terms of reforestation is something that's super easy that I think most of us understand, and carbon sequestration, which I'm hoping you can tell. And these are just white roofs down here, and I even forget what this is. I don't know if you know what this is. There we go. See, look, she knows. She didn't even know. She's like, they're clouds in the sky. I know what it is. So can you tell us a little bit about, like, what are some of these systems that we're talking about that might be closing the loop in very different ways?
Well, the top two, there's a top-down division, that whatever's on the top, those are both strategies to try to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere. So it's saying whatever we're doing, we're going to undo, right? Those are the simplest kind, except the problem with trees is they're made of CO2 basically, so they only take CO2 out while they're growing. Once they're full grown, then you're done, So the one on the right is kind of the get out of jail free card that says whatever we were going to put in the atmosphere, we just put it underground. If it stays there, that's the answer, right? So that's kind of, everybody should, that's what you end up that's the one where you say, if we can do that without spending a lot of extra money and people are willing to accept it and we can make sure that it stays down there, we're done. The problem is kind of solved. And the bottom are ways where we say, well, we can't solve it, but we'll compensate in some other way. So we're going to make the earth a little bit shinier. And there's lots of ways. So if it's more shiny, it reflects more sunlight. If it reflects more sunlight, then we would get colder, but we have the extra CO2 that keeps us warmer, and we hope we can kind of balance those two things.
That's the white roof here. Just to maybe explain, if you don't know, if you've ever touched black asphalt, it's really hot, right? If it's a lighter color or something that's not as hot, that's kind of the same type of thing going on there. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's totally fine. So if you want to say related to sustainability, I guess you could say the one on the right, presuming you can get the engineering right, is something that should resolve the problem for thousands of years. The one on the bottom right is the one that climate scientists are particularly scared about because it's so tempting for people to do because it's relatively cheap. And the problem with that one is it doesn't meet the criteria you consider for sustainability because you have to redo it every year. And if you don't get it right one year, bang, you get the accumulated warming of all the past time that you've been compensating. It's basically, I call that putting the earth on life support. And you just can't pull the plug. Once you're on life support, the plug has to be in the wall, right? And if you forget, if you trip over that cord, then it's really game over. So that's the one that makes us nervous because it's the easiest thing to resort to, and it requires a level of reliability that we may not be able to have. So I'm supposed to give some optimistic perspective. So now I've forgotten the question, so I don't think it's optimistic in there. Should I give you something else?
What is the bottom right corner?
Can you explain that a little bit? Yeah.
Those are just contrails. But I'm sure the reason they put it there is because there is a proposal to add reflective, something that makes basically all the radiative geoengineering says make the earth shinier so it reflects away sunlight. And the cheapest kind of way you can do that is not by building a fancy mirror that you have to put up with a space shuttle or something. It's just by putting up some sort of shiny white aerosols in the stratosphere so that they don't get the stagnant layer above where all the weather is. So they just sort of hover there for several years, right? Otherwise they'd flush out in a week or so. So you send up one rocket full of sulfur dioxide, it makes little aerosols that are kind of white and shiny, and you sort of see high altitude clouds, you get interesting sunsets. And the Earth is a little shinier. What?
It turns the sky white.
The sky would be a little bit whiter, but that's the whole point, right? That's the whole point, to make the sky a little bit whiter.
No mood impacts there.
So,
yeah, those are seasonal effects.
and there's all these questions about, does it exactly compensate, or you get more rain one place? But the real issue is just that you have to keep doing it reliably for thousands of years after that, and that's what I'm not convinced that we're able to be that reliable.
So I want to, actually we're coming to you, Georg. Do you want to add on that? Because I have something for you. Georg, you want to
just
go ahead.
I mean, this shows in a way that you need different solutions. you cannot only do one thing, only plant trees. But of course, these pictures are highly debatable. Why are no solar panels on the left side? Yeah. So that's the one thing. And geoengineering, exactly. So that's the majority of scientists think that's nuts. So, but anyway, it could work, but then you have to pump a lot of stuff into the oceans and into the atmosphere. Why should you do that? Why don't prevent the emissions? So, and of course, that one is adding 30% inefficiency to the whole process. So, and it's not secure. So, why don't you start somewhere else? So this is highly debatable, but of course you have to do a lot of things, and these are solutions for different parts in the world, of course.
So you must know what's coming. Can you go forward to Georg's slide? So we were debating two more. We're going to skip these. We were debating is this is what your house looks like back in Germany, or not? So in terms of closing the loop, what are some examples of the more local scale in terms of like producing energy locally or things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I would be happy to have a house, or and particularly a house with PV, but maybe a nice success story is from a little village I had the chance to visit this summer in Germany. It's called Saarbeck, and the people were just looking for a solution for the heating in the school or public building. And it's easier to start with a public building usually. And then they got some people behind, and there were some farmers and different people joining in, and then they started with biogas and a heating system which uses the heat, so electricity system which uses the heat, and then using the heat for heating the school. And that's how it started. And then that worked with the school, and then more official buildings joined in, and then the whole community joined in. And after that, they said, well, why don't we expand? And nowadays, they have, I think they bought 6 windmills, and they have solar panels all over, and they use the former military ground, which was contaminated actually, and they clean that, and they use it for solar and everything. And now they produce 6 times the energy they use. So they are energy producer, and they do it cheaper than the big utilities. And that is a nice story, and that starts with a simple idea. I mean, this looks like a very old version. These people didn't earn a lot of money; they were just enthusiasts, and they said, "Well, I should start with that." And after that, they got 20 years of feed-in tariff, and after 20 years, they got the investment back. So that looks like one of these things. And I think these success stories are nice to listen and to copy.
Great. So now you guys are in the hot seat. We're going to thank our first panel, and they're going to come back at the end. We're going to bring everyone up at the end. But at these salons, you don't just sit there. You actually have to take action. So we have your first challenge as an audience here. We're going to bring it up. It is now your turn. And so we're going to time you, and it's amazing. I love putting a stopwatch up here because people just go for it. So when we start the stopwatch, you guys are going to go. You're going to have 5 minutes, and you have 2 challenges here. We are looking at communicating climate, and we have a question for you. What needs to be done to address climate change in your community? So that's from your own personal perspective. What needs to be done to address climate change in your community? And also however you define community. And you have 2 challenges. You're going to share that with one person in the room, your idea that you don't know, and you're going to share it outside of the room. So maybe with social media, maybe with a text, maybe with a phone call. If you don't have any of those things, write it down to share with someone. Okay, so you have 5 minutes. Your challenge is to share this idea of yours, of what needs to be done to address climate change in your community with someone you don't know in the room, and then to share it outside of this room within 5 minutes. Leanne, are we ready to start? Are you guys ready? Yeah. On your mark, get set, go.
But you remember my naivety thinking I did this project with my neighbors, going to move around to the same thing, and not that they are socially disadvantaged as they are.
I'm Martin, and I think that the thing we need to do is get people to get out of their cars. And I I think that it requires a sense of
Well, it's kind of
When I lived there, it was always very, this is the glass, this is the glass, rinse everything out.
So thank you for taking part. I'm excited to introduce our next performer, who is Carson Reniers. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name, Reiners. And she is going to perform a dance piece for us. Welcome.
Do I need to introduce myself at all?
A one-sided relationship is developing quite well between you and me. I know what a leaf, petal, kernel, cone, and stem are, and I know what happens to you in April and December. Though my curiosity is unrequited, I gladly stoop for some of you, and for others I crane my neck. I have names for you: maple, burdock, liverwort, heather, juniper, mistletoe, and forget-me-not. But you have not. After all, we share a common journey. When traveling together, it's normal to talk, exchanging remarks, say, about the weather, or about the stations flashing past. We wouldn't run out of topics, for so much connects us. The same star keeps us in reach. We cast shadows according to the same laws. Both of us at least try to know something, each in our own way. And even when we don't know, there lies a resemblance. Just ask, and I will explain as best I can what it is to see through my eyes, why my heart beats, and how come my body is unrooted. But how does someone answer questions which have never been posed? And when on top of that, the one who would answer is such an utter nobody to you. undergrowth, shrubbery, meadows, and rushes. Everything I say to you is a monologue, and it is not you who's listening. A conversation with you is necessary and impossible, urgent in a hurried life, and postponed for never.
Scientists at Argonne National Laboratory at the University of Chicago. And we have Catherine Darnstadt, who is right here, who's founder and principal of Latent Design. And then last but certainly not least, Jenny Kendler, who is artist in residence at the Natural Resources Defense Council here in Chicago. So thank you to our second panel who is up here. And we're actually going to get started again, if we could go to the next one, with another little video.
Cities today have been doing the same thing that they've done for 3, 4, 5,000 years. They've been the place where the flows of people, the flows of money, the flows of goods have coalesced.
Cities are always the physical manifestation of the big forces at play. Economic forces, social forces, environmental forces.
Urban design is really the language of the city. When you walk down a street, everything you see has been designed.
Which is, we're starting to kind of look a little bit more at, there's this human component of environment somewhere in there. And my question to you guys is, how can understanding the human climate shape our future? And I want to start with you, actually, Charlie. We have a picture of something that should hopefully look familiar to you. And I'm wondering if maybe you can speak a little bit more to having a little bit more data and your project and how that might help us understand exactly what we're dealing with in terms of our human condition. Here.
Sure. Actually, this is a picture of a project that we've just begun to roll out and will be rolling out over the next year or two. And the idea is to make the city speak to us about our environment as we walk through it. And these boxes that look something like this going on light poles, the first version of them have 17 different sensors that will sense things related to air quality or noise or light in the environment. And even in a way that really deliberately preserves privacy in a way that I can't go into in detail here without getting out a whiteboard and sketching things that look funny to most of you, to give us a sense for how pedestrians are flowing through the city, just by counting the number of pedestrians that we can see without identifying them. And we think that a project like this that allows the city to tell us as we walk through it what are the conditions in a way that we don't necessarily sense ourselves. If we can walk through the city and our phones are collecting the emissions levels that we're being exposed to, or the noise levels that we're being exposed to, in ways that we've become sort of used to these things, we can look at the end of the week and say, gee, the paths that I took through the city exposed me to more volatile organics or carbon monoxide than I would like to be exposed to. So is there another path through the city or another time that I can walk from my office to the train station that reduces my exposure. And so this sort of gets to the idea that if we can give people information about what's happening around them, they can make better decisions about their own lives and contribute in some way to the city as a whole.
Great, and that actually leads perfectly to you, Catherine, and this should hopefully also be a familiar picture in terms of, so you were talking about giving people information about better movement, and we had talked a little bit before about looking and designing around how people are moving, so more observation of how, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and so much of our work is based in community, and we take a very broad focus on how, and a definition of how we look at community, and so you actually could look at it from a neighborhood and a geographic focus, and then you could also look at it at a human focus. And so for this particular project, what the image is, it's for a community of people who classify themselves as geeks and nerds, who feel that they are absolutely, completely ostracized by the general public and have no safe space to go, to talk speak what they want to speak, to talk how they want to talk, and to dress how they want to dress. And so how do we create a safe ecosystem for them for their unique needs, which are, when you break it down and actually try and anonymize it and make it not thematic, really just becomes a very good co-working space with beer and food in many ways. But you have to actually be a person who is willing to have that conversation and to take that data and to look at it and to transform it in a spatial sense. So for us at our firm, we look at, you have to have a social component before you ever get to a spatial component, because the social component is the context that you need before you could ever get to designing the content. And so when you go back to what Charlie was talking about, what is this information that we need, that's the context. And that's just a baseline to start with. That's how you open the conversation. Like, we have all of this, now let's actually try to design something because of it, not around it, not for it, but because this influences what our processes are going forward.
And that's exciting. I'm going to come to you, Jenny. So we come to this human component and understanding the social component. And you do a lot of work that's really looking at communication in new ways and creative ways, and even maybe fun or play or creativity in it. So can you speak to that, how that's important in your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually think this is an apropos place to start with a quote that I really think is wonderful by the great German artist Joseph Beuys, who talked often about how the role of artists in culture is somewhat like the role of shamans, that we should serve the purpose of shaking people out of habituated and enculturated states of mind. And so I like to think of bringing play or a sense of lightness or catharsis to some of these otherwise very challenging environmental issues as being a little bit of a key to unlocking different ways to look at these things. And so I'm really, as you noted, I'm artist in residence right now with Natural Resources Defense Council. So I'm really interested in de-siloing disciplines and bringing together people from, maybe what would traditionally be thought of as absolutely disparate disciplines, the fine arts and legislative activism or hard sciences. But I actually think that these are really actually quite intertwined disciplines, and that we have a lot to offer each other, especially given that we are in such a climate of uncertainty and facing such we really desperately need all of our creative problem solvers working on the same team right now, I think. And actually, if I'm correct, Charlie, I recently saw your project in the School of the Art Institute of Chicago's magazine, and you're working with artists on this as well. So that's just another great example of how I think that there's starting to be a little bit of a zeitgeist around this idea of letting the traditional walls of discipline fall down and saying that, we really need to all work together if we're going to make any... Yes, knocking them down if we're going to make progress on these issues. So I can describe very briefly what you're looking at here, since this probably
people are probably curious.
Visually confusing. So this was the first project I did with NRDC as their artist in residence. This was commissioned and funded by the Pulitzer Arts Foundation in St. Louis and funded by Rauschenberg Foundation. And it's essentially a food cart for monarch butterflies. And what we're doing is giving out biodegradable balloons that are filled with milkweed seed, which happens to be the only food crop for the monarch butterfly. Monarchs are currently, there's something that people have probably had, everyone in this room has had contact with or is familiar with them as a really iconic species, but their populations have plummeted by about 90% in recent years. That's largely due to pesticide use, but is also really impacted by climate change, and climate change could be really a big magnifier in pushing them towards extinction. So we are thinking about both a way to raise awareness around these issues that was light, literally, but also really that this is an art action but has a real, actual, practical, tangible effect. So we're giving people these seeds. It's Asclepias syriaca, the common milkweed. It will grow in any darn crack in the sidewalk. It is a very tenacious plant. And so we're asking people to take these home with them and pop them, releasing these floating milkweed seeds. So it creates these little vectors of dispersal. And then the seeds plant and grow and become actually a really viable food source for monarchs as they migrate from Canada to Mexico each year.
It's amazing. Have you guys, had thought of that before? Yeah? Good. So I actually, before we get to our next question for you guys, I want to invite up our next performer, who's Fatma.
Asma Esker. I'm a poet and a visual artist. I'm with Chicago Slamworks, so I'm excited to be here. In all honesty, I don't know that much about climate change, and so it was really great to get a phone call and to talk about it. And when Tara asked me to perform, she was like, well, what do you have, or do you have pieces that are related to design? And I did, and I had, in terms of social design, I really care a lot about issues of race and class and gender, and especially living in Chicago. I grew up in Boston. I've lived in a lot of different places, and I have a lot of care about that, especially in terms of when that intersects with violence. I think, especially living in Chicago, there's a lot of commentary to be talked about in terms of the way that society is designed and who gets access to what and all of that. So I actually had originally prepared 2 poems that I had memorized to come and share with you guys about that. But the first panel made me change my mind about what I was going to do, and so I brought up my computer because I'm actually going to read a poem that I thought of after that panel. So forgive me if it's a little shaky. And I think I'm one of those millennials that doesn't have a car and doesn't have a driver's license and doesn't know how to drive and all of that. But what's really interesting to me was this conversation around community and around Pilsen, where I live now, and this idea of how do you sustainability in communities, especially and I'm interested, and I would love to hear this from you all because you guys are the experts on this, about the ways that class and race intersect with climate change and community development. So I work for a lot of really fancy ass places in Chicago, including Steppenwolf and really nice theaters and nice things like that. But sometimes I think the places that I've lived have not always been traditionally seen as nice. And so this poem is called "The Corner of North and Kimball Talks Smack to the Corner of North and Halstead," or "Where I Live versus Where I Work." Mm-hmm. That Apple store looked real nice, huh? Yeah. I see. You got the water fountain out there and everything. Chairs, too. And a red line stop. Ooh, you real fancy now. Must be nice around you in the summertime with your jewelry stores and the women in dresses who wait to cross the street. What do you know of dust? Of the way dirt rises in the air every morning? What do you know of hard work? Of blue collar, of sweat and muscle, the construction workers pounding shovels into gravel? You only know already paved, trees and tame. What do you know of potholes, of open sores, of the free health clinics on the corners, and all the people who wait? Oh, you got a Starbucks? What do you know of the Dunkin' Donuts that keeps the coffee going for $1 a cup? Or the chickens locked behind the black gates that come out during summertime? Or the line of 15 people leaning against the Dunkin' Donuts sign waiting to get on the bus? Or the construction workers across from them always digging pulling off the concrete, but who stopped to help a child cross the street. And the curb is high up, and even the adults gotta jump. And the walk sign is only lit for 5 seconds before it turns red and blinking, and you gotta cross 5 lanes of traffic in the dust and rain and snow and slush, because this is Chicago, baby. We don't give you time to walk across the street or consistent weather to wear sundresses in, though the girls sure do try. North and Halstead, I've never seen anyone take a moment to make eye contact where you're at. Not even the fountain and the chairs you laid out for them gonna make them smile. They got their headphones in, shiny iPods deep in their pockets, headed in straight lines towards their cubicles. So maybe we don't got the nice chairs and the fountains in the Apple store. So maybe we got some vacant lots and dust, and our insides are open to be walked on. I'm not saying we're perfect over here. I'm just saying, here, the babies won't let you ignore them. And the people waiting for the bus, they all say hi to each other. And the construction workers help people cross the street. So maybe we don't got all the rest, but we sure do got that.
Informing your design process and how those come together to really make something that's truly livable.
Catherine, do you have some more to add to that?
Yeah, so what's interesting about these two projects is that they're within walking distance of each other, and they're very indicative of that we designed for the checkbook, that we don't design for the end constituents, and it's very obvious. These are the extreme examples of both of them. And so for myself as an architect and a practitioner, in the end, you know, we're taught to design top down, we're taught to be the experts, and we're taught not to listen. It's ingrained in us in academia to be incredibly esoteric and to be incredibly privileged, because we want rich clients because they're rich, and that makes, you know, they're smart because they're rich. And so when I started to think about this, is, you know, yeah, we're taught to design for ourselves in some way. So, okay, who if I'm going to design for myself, who am I? And so I'm the 1%, not in a financial aspect, but I'm the 1% of a minority female firm owner, the first generation of my entire family to go to college. So if I'm that 1%, then who else fits in that? And that's who I decided to design for. And that got into the question of race and space and everything beyond the building. Because the building's the easy part. I mean, it seems really technical because there's a small amount of us as architects that could design buildings, and it's an ecosystem within itself. But that building doesn't just stop at the perimeter of that boundary of that Plata survey. It goes beyond that. And so we brought all of those additional pieces. So what we look at is not only the design of those buildings, but what's that pathway? What is that, you know, subversive cartography that actually governs that neighborhood around those two buildings? And that's also what we're interested in. And we see now the students that are going through programs really want to look at the urbanism issues, because the power is there. We'd like to think that everything is designed. Tara opened with that kind of short video from Urbanize saying everything is designed. It's absolutely true. We're constantly trying to have a value proposition around design, and the sad fact is there's no power in the designed environment. There's power in the designed object, but there's power in the designed environment. And so when we talk about power as a commodity, not only sustainable power and renewable energy power, but power as in terms of the people, we have to make sure that it isn't a commodity, and we have to make sure it's equitably distributed, and that's a good problem to design for, and that's what we really want to do. So buildings are easy. Everything else around it is kind of hard, but that if it's not impossible, it's not fun, right?
Can I for a second point out that the building on our left is, if I'm not mistaken, Harry Weiss, who did a lot of historic preservation for Chicago. So it's a little bit unfair to make him look like he's the designer for the rich people.
It's not in that intent, you know. We're not trying to throw Harry Weiss under the bus in any sort of way, you know. That's not what it is. But it's talking about a housing issue, and we could blame Google for this one.
Exactly. And Jenny, I'm wondering if you might have a little bit more to add to this, and then I'll come to you on the next question. That'll be a good follow-up.
Sure. So you were asking who are we designing for, and I love all of the answers that everyone has given, and also our wonderful slam poet. But I actually want to pop us back out a level and say, what about living creatures that aren't human beings? Where do they fit in, and are we leaving any space on the planet for them? So, for example, the sociobiologist E.O. Wilson has what is a extraordinarily radical plan, but I think actually really quite possible. He and a lot of other conservation scientists have talked about wildlands corridors that would be essentially linking, so urban environments, dense, functional urban environments that are serving people in ways that are really functional and just, but that are surrounded by wildlands that are rewilded, that are restored, that allow animals to migrate. And this is going to be especially important dealing with climate change, that if you essentially have isolated populations of animals that have no way of getting to more northerly latitudes, you're essentially guaranteeing their extinction. And this is doubly true for plants who are sessile. So I am always thinking about this other issue. So I'm going to say humans and non-human animals are the ones that we're designing for.
Thank you for bringing that up. You want to add? Yeah, go for it.
Yes, I think the thing about design is almost always you're designing for someone else. And it's incredibly arrogant to think that your preferences are going to be the same as another person, either today or 50 years from now. And it's usually not intentional that we design for someone else in a sort of callous way. It's because we assume that they think the way that we do or feel the way that we do. And this sort of hit me when I was thinking about this development on the south side of a second downtown called Chicago Lakeside, which is right next to a lot of neighborhoods that are very long established neighborhoods and not the wealthy neighborhoods. And I was surprised when I read that the community residents were concerned that the development would cause their housing property values to go up. I'm like, for me, that'd be great, because I could sell my house for more than I bought it for. But that's not the way that they were thinking. They were thinking, that means I can't afford the property taxes, and I have to sell my house and move. So my view's not wrong or right, and their view's not wrong or right. They're just really different. And if I just assume that they're thinking the same way I am, then my design's going to be quite damaging to other people.
And I think that's going to lead really well. You can keep the mic because the next question is for you, actually. And we're going to come back around to a couple of you. So if we're looking at this, then how do we address climate and social inequities, which I would say are probably in a lot of ways one and the same, but not always, through design? And I want to come back to you, Charlie. We actually pulled a few tweets about your project. That different people were saying in terms of it could track the general health. We could measure weather, and there are different ways your projects could be interpreted. You might have designed it for a certain purpose, but different people had different inputs about what they saw in that. So I'm wondering if you have any follow-up to that question of how we might address some of the inequities in our systems that we have.
Well, first of all, I'll say, please go and vote for us. We were just kind of horsing around with sensors, and then somebody put us up for a design award. I don't know how that happened. The design of these sensor boxes came from a lot of discussions with a lot of different kinds of people in the science community and in the residents community about what they were interested in learning about their environment. From the scientists, it was, what do you not understand about cities that you think you might be able to understand better if we had better data about what's happening inside the cities? So what that resulted in was actually not strictly a sensor pack that goes on the pole, but a platform that goes on the pole into which we can place new devices or new sensors continually over the next several years. And so it's designed so that it's easily adaptable, so that if a new type of sensor comes available, as they will, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, we can put them out there and learn something about our environment. Part of that is maybe Janet works in a city. You have no choice in most cities but to manage by sort of reaction to events. And you can watch those events over a period of time and try to get a trend, but you don't often have the opportunity to manage conditions and watch and see, oh, this condition is moving in a direction we don't want it to move. And so I as a city, want to intervene before it becomes a big problem. So, in the ROM's administration, It's all about, can we move from reactive policy to proactive policy? So if we have problems with some parts of the city with asthma, rather than using humans as sensors and going, oh, we have all these people sick, so there must be a problem, why don't we use like electronics as sensors and sort of fix the problem before the humans get sick?
I like that idea. Catherine, I want to come to you, and we actually have an example of 4 projects that should look familiar. I'm wondering if you can maybe use one of these to kind of touch on that question of how we might use design to address some of these inequities that we do see, and inequities that are more inequities that, or new inequities that might arise or be exacerbated by climate change.
Right, and so one of the things that we look at, and we have about projects on the right are dealing with public space, and we have about 500,000 square feet of public space that we'll be working on over the next couple of years. So if you need poles, Charlie, we will have them for you to attach to. And then on the left, we're dealing with projects that are built projects in buildings that are dealing with kind of social services and around clients that are there, and then we have a whole series that are private. But I'll talk about the one in the lower right, and this was for an organization that's down in the Roseland and Pullman neighborhood, and they're a non-for-profit that provides services to young women 12 through 18, predominantly African American with a small Latino population. And they approached our firm and they said, we want a new community center. That's what we want. And we're like, okay, that sounds great. And what do you want in it? And they wanted everything and the kitchen sink. And as you're going through the program, and they say, we want science labs. And so we stopped and we said, well, what's a science lab to you? And science was very Bunsen burners and lab coats and goggles, and that was science. And the reason that they said that is because in the schools around the area where they were working, they haven't had functioning science labs for years. So the last time they had science, it was Bunsen burners, lab coats, and goggles. And then since then, it's just been descriptions about science. And so we said, well, if you're teaching this next generation of young women about are going to be leaders in our communities, and you're going to tap into and talk about STEM, let's talk about citizen scientry, let's talk about that we're building you a 30,000 square foot science lab in the form of a building, and let's talk about the science that's outside your neighborhood and the power that you could use with that information to actually transform the neighborhood. So what happened from there is we not only developed the building, but we developed an academic curriculum for them. It was a STEM-based design build studio that went out and taught building skills, because again, we're coming back to that 1% that I see myself falling in. So if I want more young women, if I want more minority women as architects, engineers, and contractors, I'm not going to build them a Barbie doll. I'm going to give them a hammer, because they have to break that glass ceiling. So we went and we were like, let's go build. And so they took a 2-week boot camp of design and construction skills where they learned design thinking around a problem of vacant lots in around the Roseland and Pullman neighborhood. So this is a block on 103rd and around Eberhart, which it pretty much goes vacant lot, church, 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 vacant lot, church, vacant lot. And that's how that street goes. And so they said, okay, we have an issue around a vacant lot. This is actually in between a church and a liquor store. So we got lucky on that one. We got a little bit of everything. And the girls went out, and from day one, they knew nothing about construction, nothing about design. And then they built a whole entire playground in 2 weeks. And they built it around the concept of Switzerland. And this is a concept that they came up absolutely out of themselves. And so they came up with Switzerland because not only did they want a space that was neutral in concept, but also something that, and it was brilliant. I mean, they're in high school. But also had topography. And so what you see here is you have a blue deck, which is a river. You have these rope climbing walls, which are part of the mountains. Towards the front, you have the street, and in the back, you have a huge sandbox area that becomes the beach. So they created an artificial topography and an artificial safe space for themselves and for actually the younger children. They said, we're fine, we'll make it through high school, we got all these programs, but my little brother, my little sister might not. And so that's when we start to look at it, and that's the system of beyond the building. So with that program, that actually got them local awards, national funders, international accolades. That actually made the funding around the building of our community center, which is like, another community center, we could use like one of those every block. But it made it actually easier for them to fundraise around that, and it changed their whole entire idea of their organization from going, we provide after-school programming, so we're community developers. Because that's what it means. That's the shift that they had to go through to do that, and that's how we kind of look at who we're designing for, and that's the end constituents. The client has a checkbook, but who they serve is who we're designing for and with, really.
I think will be a good follow-up in terms of thinking of design and different components that lead to or speak to some of the injustices that we do have in our systems. And when we had talked, a little bit about kind of this idea of efficiency and livability. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, it's the couple things that sort of, I guess, get all wrapped up into that. I mean, one of them, I think when we were talking specifically, I talked about the fact that cities are naturally very efficient places. The density of cities means that people are usually living with using less resources. A great example of that is that CNT did a study of the Chicago region, and they looked at CO2 emissions. And when you looked at the city and went out to the suburbs and the exurbs, of course, it looked like the city was really bad because we produced the most CO2 emissions comparatively. It got better. It got worse and worse as you got towards the center. But of course, as soon as you looked at that on a per capita basis, the entire image flips. And the city's actually producing far less CO2 emissions per person than the suburbs, and they're producing less than the exurbs and so on, right? So there's this sort of natural efficiency that you get to take advantage of. But of course, efficiency does not mean livable. It doesn't mean that it's beautiful. It doesn't mean it's where we want to live. And so the key, I think, or one of the keys to sort of addressing the fact that, one, actually people right now want to live in livable, walkable, dense communities, but also getting them to do that and taking advantage of that efficiency is to ensure that they're beautiful, right? Because people lived in cities in far greater, there's more people living in the cities, but we actually had larger and denser cities in the 40s and stuff, right? That's when cities like Chicago became really big, and we had all these thriving neighborhood business districts all over, and people were shopping local, and they were walking, and they weren't driving as much, right? And then they all left the cities. Well, what happened? Well, the cities became unlivable. They didn't become less efficient. They didn't change their efficiency. They became places that people didn't want to live as much. They didn't have those things that we all sort of need to survive that go way beyond just efficiency. And so I think that's really important. But I also think it's really important to know that livability comes in part from maintainability, and I don't just mean that in the strict sense of like, did you pull the weeds kind of thing. Communities have to be self-sustaining places, and that gets very much tied into social justice, right? They can't just be always needing new. They need to be self-sustaining. And people can't maintain what they don't understand. And that's, a fundamental, I think, role of the designer is not only to help the building and the designing, but help with the understanding, which I think also gets at what Catherine was talking about, what Charlie's talking about with data, what you're trying to do with art. It's getting it so that people can understand it enough that then they go, oh, I understand why this is important to maintain. I understand why this is important to me, my community, and then that's, I think, really when you flip the switch.
Wonderful, thank you. We're going to come back and kind of circle back to these issues, and once we started with the first panel, and bring everyone up in just a minute. But we have one last performer, and then 2 more questions for the full panel, so you guys are in the home stretch. So I want to, I think we can actually leave, and I want to, can we thank these guys? This is really amazing work.
I'm going to actually go ahead and use the microphone because I've been a little ill this week to make sure that all of you guys can hear me. My name is Mojde Stokely, as you see there. Is everything good? My name is Mojde Stokely. I am a teaching artist and the outreach coordinator for Chicago Slam Works. So that means that I help place our teaching artists and performers into schools and organizations. So if any of you guys want to talk to me about that, that's wonderful. I used to make a lot of work about ecological design and so forth. I have a love-love relationship with William McDonough and his concept of cradle to cradle. So I'd like to share a quote of his before I read my poem, because I just think about it a lot. We achieve our mission to go to the moon. Let's look home from that lofty perch and reimagine our mission on Earth. That is what we need to do here. Together we can upcycle everything. The world will be better for our positive visions and actions. William McDonough. So this poem also starts with a quote. That's by Rumi. Raise your words, not your voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder. What does it mean to cover landfills with grass and call it Millennium Park, Grant Park? We are walking on lies of omission because the mayor doesn't like to tell those stories. Visit our pretty parks, our pretty manufactured parks. One strain of grass that may live forever, but women in Malaysia are fighting to continue planting seeds that they have cultivated for centuries because nobody told them that Monsanto could patent the genetic blocks that build their land's histories. According to official estimates, India has at least 400 languages, but experts suspect that it's closer to 700. Many are at risk of dying out. The effects could be devastating. Each language is like a key that can unlock knowledge about natural medicine, climate patterns, spiritual, artistic, and mythical histories. In rural India, Hindi and English are not only in vogue, you cannot get a job unless you upgrade your language. Right now, there's a dying language beneath our feet, plants that speak volumes. But we trample and pull and bulldoze and concrete over to build utopias. Every Valentine's Day we are reminded only that red roses say, I love you, but what of the love messages of jasmine or purple lilacs or morning glories? The sprinkling of oats would be likened to singing songs in some trampled culture. Sing me a song, O lovers. What will our grandkids think of us when they unfold layers of polyvinyl dirt to find Coke bottles, iPods, and novelty keychains that read YOLO because you only live once? So why shouldn't the color of used condom wrappers and Twinkies that were manufactured when we were kids still be brilliant and glistening for generations after we die? The language of Ayapaneco has been spoken in Mexico for centuries. It survived the Spanish conquest, seen off wars, revolutions, famines, and floods, but now there are only 2 people who speak this language, and they refuse to speak to each other. A striped carnation is a kind refusal. Marigolds speak of pain and grief, elderflowers of compassion. We have corporate-sponsored birds' nests featuring the threads and stripes of American apparel that went to the dumpster instead of the Goodwill because of misprints and factory mistakes. Make me a meal that speaks to me sustainably. Make it of cumin and apples and coriander because they speak to me. Rosemary, a symbol of remembrance, adorn it with almonds to lock in your promise, and chestnuts because in the old world it meant do me justice. Do us all justice before it all dies out. We are standing on a dying language. Why would you trample such poetry? I'm no fool. I know what they do after the festivals in the park. They roll out factory-made grass to cover up our footsteps and litter. I know what happened when the stone eroded along the shore on the south side as garbage spilled into our Great Lake. But our mayor doesn't think he has the language to tell these stories. Thank you.
What do I want? Change! When do I want it? Now! What do I want? Change! When do I want it? Now! We stand together as one, literally as one person, for change.
If you don't know, know, there actually is on Sunday the People's Climate March in New York City, where everyone is invited to come. We're hoping for at least 200,000 people in the streets to really show that we want climate action. But also, we're asking for us to all take action in our own communities. Again, how we define that. So whether it's you with a bugle on the street corner, or I don't know, but maybe some of you do. I'm sure there's some actions already organized here in Chicago to get involved with and to really put these issues in a very personal way on a stage for the world to see that we care. So I want to invite all of the speakers to come on up again. Don't be shy. And if there isn't a chair, can you bring a chair with you? We have 2 more questions for you. So this last bit, right in the middle, facing us, that's great. I like that. I like that. Her back to the audience, we'll see.
Yeah, that's true. It's like creating new plans.
I know. Design thinking, we're already started. So my question to you guys is, and I want you guys to think about this too, and maybe this can be a topic of conversation for the ending networking in a few minutes, is we're looking at this idea of design and design thinking and climate change and social justice and systems, and how can design be a unifying force? Or can design be a unifying force? And I'm going to leave it up to you. Does someone want to take a stab at that? Does anyone feel passionately about that?
If I'm going to be selected out, I mean, one of the things that we could look at is design as a unifying force, and I think you saw it even in the little parody video, is that there's this fine line between being crazy and being king or queen, you know, if we're going to be gender equal here. It's that you actually don't need to be the leader, you actually have to be the first follower, and that's where all the power is. And so that person and that woman who is there with her drum and with her podium is she's fucking crazy, right? But the moment that there's 2 people there, that's the start of a movement. And so I think that's how we all have to start to look at this, as design being a unifying force, is the design of it always goes back to the social systems that are there. And so I think one thing that's really uniquely then also back to part of kind of like our American ethos is that we're taught to be leaders. Like, God forbid you should like ever be a follower growing up, but I think that's what makes the power of it and makes the power of these movements and the power of these systems. So when we design it, we design a social system that allows for all of us to be the expert citizen in some ways, or be the citizen expert, and allows that to be within this equal playing field overall. So it's the design of the social systems that we need to look at.
Liz, did you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about some research that's been done on climate change and why it's such a controversial issue for people. So there's a wonderful researcher at Yale called Dan Kahan, and he's looked at lots of different issues. Most issues that you look at where there's some controversy, the more knowledge people have, the more they will start converging on some issue. Like the more quantitative ability they have and the more information, the more groups that were different will start to feel the same. But then there's a couple pathological issues in society where the more information people have, the stronger they feel about it and the more divergent their opinions are. And climate change is one of those. The more quantitatively skilled people are, the more they'll go in camps where they're like, this is a disaster, or this is a lie. And those are issues that have become pathological, right? People's emotions are way ahead of their reasoning. And climate is one of them. And when the research has said, how do you bring people together, how do you take that weird emotion out of it so that people can think again? The answer to how to start talking to each other again has typically been not, trying to convince the other side by shouting, right? This is a lie, louder and louder, this is a disaster, louder and louder. But by sitting together and taking the emotional tone down and planning something in a very practical way. Okay, what are we going to do? Making the issue boring again and getting into design, because once people are starting to think about, okay, now what would we do and what would work and what doesn't work, it takes the emotion away from it. So in that sense, design can be a unifying force because it removes people from a situation where you're just fearful of the issue itself and you've gotten down to brass tacks and said, okay, now what would we really do? And so in that sense, design makes people practical, and being practical suddenly makes the issue actually solvable.
That's great, because that even comes back to what we had talked about in the very beginning in terms of, do we make great decisions when we're fearful or when we're angry, or those really intense emotions the rational thinking tends to get pushed back a little bit. Does anyone else feel a strong desire to address this too?
I think part of what Liz is saying, at least what I'm hearing, is, or the way I think of it is, design can be unifying, because if you're sitting down with someone to design something, that means that you're sharing some goal. And when you get people heading in the same direction, they may have differences about how to get there, but if you can at least agree to some direction to go, people tend to work together in a better way.
I would say you don't even need to get them to agree first. You have them start thinking about where to go.
Something needs
right?
to be.
As opposed to shouting at each other to try to convince each other to go in the same direction. Just the act of being practical helps people get out of their fearful zone.
Great, and actually maybe can we see if the next question might give you room for comment? So this is our last question for you, and feel free to pull back the one we just did, but if we're thinking of design could be a unifying force, which we're talking about right now, is what do we need to grow a climate smart design for all that is inclusive? Georg, does that relate to anything you're thinking in your head?
It does. Actually, it's much too much in my head what I could explain, but I understand design in a way that it's an example for doing something. So design can be a design for policy to show leadership, or design can be what the people will try in 1.5 years in Paris to design a treaty which works for the whole world, which is a very tough task actually. Design can be also very limiting. So if we say, well, that is one design which has to work for everybody, I would say we need different designs at different levels, and each design will be an example which shows other people, well, it's possible.
And Jenny, do you maybe have something to add to this?
Yeah, and I think that artists actually can play an important role in this in terms of a little bit of what you said, like being the one crazy person on the sidelines, that in art that you really have this permission to fail. And so we all get to be kind of like, iterative little spark boxes, throwing off ideas and seeing what might catch and turn into something that becomes a real functional project. But I also, the reason I said, oh, you've got this, is because I was thinking initially with that first question that when you were talking so much about collaboration and actually how art, and especially I'd like to say in Chicago, and especially at this timely moment, that social practice is really, you guys should all look out for the exhibit that's going to be at the Art Institute that's about social practice and art. So that's art that's really bridging the divide between traditional artistic practices and activism. And Chicago is really known as the home of that. And there'll be a new exhibition on that. But it really, a lot of what it's talking about is how do we actually engage with community members and say that, well, we as the artists or we as the designers, maybe we don't know everything. And in fact, what we're gonna do is be facilitators. And we're gonna be, like Joseph Boy said, like the shamans that lead the group and wait and see what emerges.
And maybe, do you have something, maybe the final words?
See if I can do the final words. When you asked the earlier question, I was thinking, well, one of the common things between all types of design is that it's a problem-solving process. And I think people, again, who get involved with design, they're pulled into that. It's this, you've got some problem and you've got to try to come up with what the solution is. And of course, when you look for solutions, then you have to, I believe, ask questions, right? Because you are not going to get there unless you ask some questions. And if you ask questions, then you have to listen, or you won't hear the answers. And I think when you think about that and then you try to look at this next question, what do we need to grow climate smart design? Well, I think we all need to listen a lot better, because when we listen, then we hear more. And to solve these types of problems, we have to hear more. One of the problems that's happened, I think, with design is that, like so many things in society, it's become very siloed. You are a designer of this, you are a designer of that, and you have a specialty, and you work very hard at that, and you're very good at that, and and you've spent all this time and energy and education, and you then start to work with those people, and then you start to go to conferences about those people, and then you're almost talking to your own self, because you're surrounded by the people who think like you think and are thinking about those problems. And they're amazing people, and they're working really hard to solve problems. But because of the way we've done that, even when we're listening, we don't hear a bigger conversation. And to solve climate change, we have to hear the bigger conversation. We have to understand how things interact. We have to understand, that the plants are important and that they are speaking a language, and that we have to understand that the butterflies need a place to eat and move through our cities, and we have to understand that people have a right to have safe places to live and access to clean water and all the things we all talk about. And I guess that would be my big thing, is that designers ask questions, but we have to open up our ears and hear more.
That was not scripted, I just want you to know. I think that was a really beautiful end to this part of the conversation, and I want to thank all of you in this room for being a part of this. I hope it was inspiring, and I hope that this is the beginning, or the continuation of a lot of amazing work that all of you are doing. We have until 9:30 to really talk to each other and finish all the food and drinks in here. But wait, you can't get up yet. You guys have to do one more thing. We're done. It's your turn again, and there's a sheet of paper and pen on your chair, and if you don't have one, you can write this in your phone. And we're going to collect these from you, because we want to hear your ideas. We've been collecting ideas from each city we're going to. And I want to know, how are you going to, in quotes, redesign your life to address? And so we want to hear, how are you going to redesign your life? And while you're thinking about that, because we've been talking a lot about risk-taking and being on the edge, and at the Human Impacts Institute, we are a little crazy as well. And I want to really give a lot of credit to my colleagues, Leanne and Tess, who are in the room, who were so significant in really a team effort in pulling this all together. So thank you guys so much. We have one last thing. While you're thinking about redesigning, ending on a light note, kind of absurd. So if you don't do this, this is what might happen. All right, thank you guys so much, and please write this down and give it to Leanne in the back. Thank you guys.